I'm Jamie Smart, and you're listening to the Results Mindset Podcast, the show that helps you have less on your mind so you can achieve the results that matter to you and enjoy the journey every step of the way. In this episode, I've got something very special for you because it's an interview with a dear friend and colleague of mine, Chipman. Now, this interview was done way back in 2010, and it was for members of one of my year-long programs, and this interview was just for them originally. But it's had such a great impact on people over the years that I decided to share it on the podcast. Now, Chip's one of my own mentors and one of the people who's made a really big difference in my own life over the years, and also in the lives of many of my clients, because Chip and his wife, Jan, actually joined me to deliver the Clarity Life Transformation Retreat each year. And it's a beautiful 5-day in-depth experience, a deep dive into the principles behind clarity. So he and Jan are going to be joining me again this year in May. We're doing it in Tenerife. And if you want to find more about that, then go to jamiesmart.com/retreat. Now, here's the interview with Chip, and it starts with him answering the first question I asked him, which is around what first sparked your interest in the principles behind clarity, in the inside-out understanding. So I give you Chipman.
Oh, that's a good lead-in, all right. A long story, but I'll try and give the abridged version and keep the good parts in. Well, we're going back to 1976, 75. My wife has given me the 5 sign. It's 1975. I'll just give you a little background. I came from a family of 11 people, 11 kids, with mom and dad, and I was the oldest. And I'm not going to go into it too much, but suffice it to say that it was a home filled with alcohol, violence, negativity, unhappiness, And I grew up in that environment, and I would say to characterize my personality as a young man, I was aggressive, defensive, angry, basically. And I lived my life that way until I met my beautiful wife, and I took a year or two off of that anger because Jan was the very first person I had ever really gotten to know in my life who was a happy person. I had never really known a happy person. So, that's one of the reasons I fell in love with her, and it took me a solid 3 years to get her as upset and angry as I was. So it's funny how that works, right? If you don't have knowledge, that's the direction it'll go. Well, to shorten the story up, we were going along probably not too far from divorce. We had a young son, and we were reaching the end, and I was very, very, to say the least, depressed, and really couldn't even see continuing with life, to be perfectly honest. And then quite by accident, seriously, quite by accident, my wife was with some friends and ended up going over to a house that turned out to be Sid Banks' house. And as she tells the story, she didn't know what was going on. There was a group of people sitting in a living room talking, and this one man was talking very gently. And my wife had studied anthropology at university and was very, very interested in the spiritual aspect of life, especially as it applied to Aboriginal cultures and so on. And what she explains is, listening to Sid, she heard everything she'd ever heard that she considered wise from her childhood, whether it was in her religion or in her college courses about her Aboriginal spirituality and their view of life. And she was taken with this person. She went in there a very insecure person, and then something clicked. The way Jan describes it, she says that from being totally hopeless, she then, in one moment, saw her light stretched out before her in a very positive, she knew life was going to be beautiful. And she left there a different person. Now, I'm at home. I don't know any of this is going on, and I'm still as upset as ever. And Jan comes home, and it's like this different person, right? And it really put me off. In fact, I didn't like it at all. I was very disturbed by this happiness, by this lightheartedness that Jan came home with. And I attempted over the next few days to bring her back where I knew her. And you know, anybody that's been in a relationship or has a partner knows what I mean by that. I would press her red buttons. And at first she would bite, you know, she would get upset. But I'd always see this moment when she would look at me and just say something like, you know, I'm just not doing that anymore, hon. And it would infuriate me. And, you know, I kept thinking this would be over in a day or two and we get back to normal. And then it was, this will be over in a few days. And then it was, this will be over in a week. And it just never went away. And, you know, finally I brought out the big guns, the big bright red button that couples are never supposed to mention. And I threw that at Jan, and she got upset. I hurt her feelings, and then I saw it again. I saw this light, this understanding in her eye, and it just really, really upset me, you know. And I figured that's it. We're not going to be able to stay together. It's really bad when your wife gets happy. It's not a good thing. So anyway, then came my twist of fate. We were talking to some friends who happened to be people who were listening to Sid, and I wouldn't have anything to do with Sid. I thought it was the silliest thing I ever heard of. It was, you know, I was a searcher. I was looking through Buddhism and Eastern religion and philosophy and pop psychology, and this guy was like Mr. Ordinary. I mean, who's listening to this welder on Salt Spring Island off the west coast of Canada, and why would they, you know? So anyway, I was in this conversation with this woman, and I had as they say, a bone to pick with this woman, because I figured a lot of this stuff that Jan was talking about, this, you know, it's only thought, and happiness is only one thought away. I thought it was coming through this woman, and I considered it interference in my marriage. So it happened to be that we got together socially, and I was laying in wait, so to speak, to let this woman know that I didn't want her talking to Jan about all this stuff. And she made the mistake as we sat down saying, Chip, what's on your mind? And, oh, man, she couldn't have asked a worse question, you know. I got really upset, and I started laying into her about it. My marriage was none of her business, and this is a bunch of simplistic, silly, stupid stuff. And she put her finger up to my face, which in those days was not a smart thing to do in most cases. And she just looked at me. She said, Chip, the only thing that stands between you and Jan and all the love and happiness in this world is thought. And my mind started to reel and was going to say, what a stupid comment. But I happened to look over her shoulder, and Jan was sitting there. And this feeling just went, and I was just gripped with emotion. I started to tear up. I didn't want to do that in this company. I couldn't understand what was going on. The feelings I was experiencing, I mean, I hadn't felt feelings like that ever, and they were so foreign to me, I really didn't even know what they were. But I was filled with this feeling of love for Jan, and I was overwhelmed by it, and it upset me. And I just remember now, this is only a way of explaining something I can't explain. But at that moment, it was like I was looking around inside of my head, and I could clearly see that all of our issues and all of our problems were like these little piles of thought in my head. That's what it looked like to me, like these little piles of thought. And I remember thinking very clearly, well, of course it's just thought. What else could it be? And that just did it. I couldn't take any more, and I stood up and made some comment about how stupid and simplistic this was, and left their home. Jan came with me after she apologized for my behavior. And all the way home to our place, the one thought that kept occurring to me is, you're caught. You know, yet my ego wasn't ready to accept it. And I hung out in that miserable, miserable state for another week or so. Then one day I was sitting on the couch and I was watching Jan play with our son. And out of nowhere, that feeling just rushed in. And I was absolutely filled with feeling. And I remember thinking a very simple thought. All I have to do is surrender. And everything, absolutely everything, in my life, in Jan's life, in our life, changed from that moment forward. It had already changed for Jan, but I'll always be grateful for that because, I remember in Buddhism, there was a way of talking about teaching. I think it's like the student is asking the master, what's the best way to teach? And the master says the best way to teach is to show people the bridge. And for me, the bridge was shown by Jan living in that state of mind. She didn't try and change me. She didn't try and fix me. She lived in that healthier state of mind. She moved into a new world, and I was left with the dilemma of observing it and discounting it, or observing it and realizing that we had stumbled onto something very profound. And fortunately for me, I finally got to see that. So I'm always grateful to Jan for showing that to me. And then we started listening to the Sid. I still had a hard time listening to him because to me it was very, very simplistic. And even after I acknowledged the power of the change in Jan and the power that I was seeing from Sid's teaching, I wouldn't quite look at it.
That's just a great way of setting the scene, Chip. That's a great story. I've never heard it quite like that before.
Oh, it's the shortened version for sure.
Well, one of the things that came to mind as you were speaking when you were talking about show them the bridge, I heard you talking recently about thought being a bridge, and when you're on the crest of the bridge, you can look both ways. Is there a connection between these bridges, so to speak?
Well, absolutely. It's the same bridge. I mean, what I really saw, what Jan really showed me first of all, she gave me the faith by staying in that state of mind. But what I actually saw in that first insight was the power of thought. I saw that it was thought. Now, what I didn't know then and I learned later, and I remember when Sid first said this to me, it kind of took me off guard, was that thought was the bridge to the past and all our lostness and our insecurities and our fears and all the things we go through in life. That's what creates it. But it is also the bridge to freedom. Thought is also the bridge or the vehicle that carries us to the spiritual world. That thought is both. And the analogy we used in the call last week is that, when you listen to wisdom, like if you listen to one of Sid's tapes or CDs, or you read his books, or anybody else that you really think is an enlightened person, there's always a chance, it's not guaranteed, but there's always a chance that for one moment your thought system will slow down, that you'll reach a point where the world you're creating moment to moment will temporarily stop, if only for a half a second. At that moment, you're standing on the crest of a bridge, and you can look in two directions. You could look back at the world you've been in and see how it's created, or you could look back and just go back into it, or you can turn around and look at the unknown. You can turn around and look at the now. The now and the unknown are the same. They're the same thing. I mean, you're not in the now if you're thinking about the known. You're in the past, And so we tend to think of looking at the unknown as a scary process, but it really isn't. We get these opportunities to just look and stand in the unknown and be close to our true selves. And it is a little scary at first because it's foreign to us. We're so used to living within the context of our thinking, living at the end of our thinking, And yet when we turn and face that other direction on that bridge, what we're doing really is embracing universal thought. We're embracing divine thought. We're embracing that part of us that everybody has a piece of. Everybody is that divine thought. And when we embrace that, we enter into a new world. That's why this psychology that's the most important distinction between this new psychology that's born out of the three principles and the old psychology is that the old psychology was about rattling around and trying to dissect the problem. The new psychology ignores the problem, basically, other than to listen with compassion, but basically ignores the problem and shows people the potential of a new world and shows people a new world.
Well, that's a point I'd like to jump in at, Chip, because for a lot of people on the call who are involved in NLP and more kind of what's called positive psychology, those modalities tend to ignore the problem as well and focus on what a person wants to create, or, they're more outcome focused than problem focused. But my experience of principles-based psychology is that there's a big distinction between principles-based psychology and what we might call positive psychology, in that it's positing this other world, you could say, i.e. the world of the possible that's there when we step out of our thinking.
Yes, I mean, more positive psychologies are obviously a step in the right direction in terms of it's better to be looking at that than wandering around in all that garbage. However, there's still a very, very primary distinction, and that's this. Like, I would characterize the healing that occurs from learning about the true nature of the principles as happening outside of our thought system. In other words, the way it looks to me is you learn to listen to a point where you have an insight and your mind gets quiet, and you actually go to that wisdom that we've always had within us. It's our birthright. It's always been there. It will always be there, no matter how messed up we get, no matter how complicated our lives get. There's a place and a state of mind within us that's wisdom. You can call it true self. You can call it whatever you want. Now, the difference in this approach to helping people is that the real thing that happens is people go to this quiet state and they encounter wisdom, okay? And then they look back on their life, good and bad, and they see it from an entirely new perspective. And in that sense, because they're looking at it from a point of wisdom, their thinking is automatically reordered. There's no need to try and sort it out in any way. There's no need to think positively. There's no need to apply any technique or model, because you're actually seeing. You're seeing the world from a brand new place. Like the example for me is, I looked at my father with a great deal of hate for many years, even after I met Sid. And I can remember saying to Sid, Sid, this is beautiful stuff, and I see it changing lots of lives. And you talk about forgiveness a lot. And I said, Sid, I got to tell you, there's no way in this world I could ever forgive my father for his violence and stuff. And Sid knew the story. And he would turn to me and say the craziest stuff, like he would turn to me and say, geez, Chip, your father must have really been suffering to do those things. And to be honest with you, that was long after I met him, maybe even a year. I would get angry with Sid and I would be upset until I had an insight one night. And I went to this really beautiful state of mind. And then I looked back at my upbringing and my father, and I saw him with compassion. I saw him with love. I'm not saying that I would put up with the behavior. I saw that he was caught up and lost in his thinking, and it was horrible thinking. And who knows? Well, actually, I do know what happened to him as a child. And it was perpetuated for generations in my family. But all of a sudden, I saw this poor soul that really was suffering. And to my absolute shock, I felt love for my father, And that's what I mean by you're not reordering your thinking. You're not trying to think positively about your past or whatever. You go to a state of mind where your thinking is actually automatically reordered. Like when I looked back after that experience, I didn't have to think about what I was thinking. I saw it in a totally new way. I saw my father in a new way, and I saw myself in a new way. And the most amazing thing came out of that. That happened as I was laying in bed one night thinking about him. The next day when I woke up, I was in the quietest, most peaceful state of mind I had ever experienced in my entire life. And what I came to understand about that is that when that insight occurred, I dropped volumes and volumes and volumes of thinking about my past and myself and who and what I was. They went away, and I saw the world from a totally new perspective. Now,
and that's been my experience working with these principles as well. Personally, my experience has been that when those insights come to me and things really change in a big way, it hasn't been as the result of a process or, there's a certain amount of, I don't know if you want to call it luck or fortune or whatever, but it just sort of, it happens when it happens, and it happens in the way it happens. And then I see things differently.
Yeah. We were talking.
Very, very powerful.
That's really, really deep, Jamie. We were talking on the call yesterday, and I think that's what you're referring to a little bit, that you really can't involve volition in trying to get to the state. And yet, there is something that you have to have, and what I think that is a big picture, an overview desire to find peace and to find that spiritual state. You can't be thinking about it. You can't be trying to get there. You just have to decide that that's the direction that you want. And then listen to wisdom wherever you can find it. And Sid used to say, point yourself in the right direction and do nothing. And it took me a long time to really understand what he meant by that. And I still, in some ways, don't. But actually, in many ways, I do. Because once you set yourself in that direction, every time you listen to wisdom or you read wisdom, what's actually happening is you're talking to your true self. You're listening to your true self. And the only way that we can really learn what the true self is not to think about it or try and figure out or try and get there, is to simply, when your mind is quiet, it's like you stand with your true self. You begin to experience life from that perspective. And the experience of it is the only thing that really counts. Once you experience that quiet, you experience insight, you're on your way. And then it's truly, truly, truly a matter of patience. Because every time you strive or say, I'm going to get there, or I'm going to try this, or I'm going to try and quiet my mind, it's a setup. You're thinking again, your ego's got a hold of your journey. And because I've been there many times.
And I find it's quite a subtle one. Like, I might be kind of like, okay, you know what, I'm going to go for a walk. And that can, in going for a walk, I might find myself in a more quiet place. But the more I go for a walk in order to get into a quiet place, the less likely I am to get there.
Yeah, that's true. And it's not to say that giving yourself quiet and going for nice walks isn't helpful. But you nailed it, Jamie. It's when that thought is in your head, I'm doing this because. See, the thing is, it's a real dichotomy. It's a real paradox because we're searching for something we already are. It's what we are at our core. It is our true self. And anything we do to search for our true self it's perpetuating the duality. And anything we do that just listens to that truth and has that experience is moving towards the oneness.
Well, Chip, I have a sense of what you mean by point yourself in the right direction, then do nothing. I also know for a lot of the people listening, it will be like, but if I point myself in the right direction and do nothing, I'm not going to get anything done, and I'm not going to get where I'm going. Yet I have the benefit of knowing a little more about your story. How did you come to be teaching the principles? Because I know that in some ways came from a place of pointing yourself in the right direction and doing nothing, or at least I think it did, if I understand correctly. How did you come to be teaching the principles?
Well, let me just address the whole do nothing thing just briefly, so people aren't worried about that. We're not talking about what you do in the world every day. We're talking about doing nothing in terms of striving to find yourself. And the wonderful thing is that as your mind gets quieter, and that's part of it, letting go of all that, you begin to see much more clearly what you want to do in life. It actually, wisdom informs the intellect. The intellect is downstream from wisdom, so it really can't even begin to truly understand what wisdom is. But wisdom informs the intellect, and as our minds get quieter and we live in that peaceful state more and we have more insights, our intellects become much more valuable to us. We make clearer decisions. We become more passionate and more motivated in what we do intrinsically and automatically. So I just wanted to kind of clear that up a little bit.
Well, can I get another clarification, Chip, just for people who aren't so clear on it yet, is what's the distinction that you make between wisdom and intellect? Because I know you experience them as very, very different. What's that distinction?
Okay. Well, the intellect to me is a tool that we're given to maneuver our way through this world, through the material world. You know, at birth, we come out in this world and we immediately start storing and information and giving it certain values and so on. That's the intellect, and the intellect and the ego are actually one. And I don't mean ego in a bad way. Ego can be a serious problem, obviously, and it can be public enemy number one at times. But we all have to have an ego. That all an ego says is that we have this sense of existing. You know, that we have this identity that we think we are. It's not who we are, but it's who we think we are. But yet to live in this world, you have to have an intellect and an ego. And so when the ego and the intellect get married and they think that they're something special, and all they are is a bunch of information, of stored information, that's kind of what creates our problems. Like my anger is an example, is an experience of my intellect trying to deal with the world and taking on coping mechanisms and habits and beliefs and so on. Wisdom is upstream from all of that. Wisdom is it sounds grandiose, but wisdom is the knowledge of all time and all things. And every human being has that in them. Wisdom is the clarity and understanding that we're all looking for in life. And it's innate. It's within us, you know. And the beauty is that wisdom, that knowledge that we have within us, once we tap into it, it educates and clears up our intellect. We use our intellect for what it's really meant to be, and that's a tool. And my experience is that people who really get a sense of what wisdom is and actually experience their own wisdom, their intellect becomes more highly refined and more responsive to their lives and less reactionary to life, put it that way. The intellect is just a wonderful tool. Wisdom is who we really are. It's like if you think about all the thoughts in our head, well, we have all these thoughts about who we are, what we've experienced, but who's looking at those thoughts? What's looking at those thoughts? Our deepest consciousness, our true self, we are deeper than those thoughts. We are more than those thoughts. That's what wisdom is, you know. Now, once you encounter wisdom, it's amazing what happens with your intellect. It becomes more creative, becomes less bound by your former beliefs, become more capable to look at the new and explore the world with an open mind. All of those things happen. So I don't know if that answers your question, Jamie, but
that answers it really well. Really well. So, yeah, the other thing that came up when you were talking about that, which kind of relates to my earlier question as well, is you said when you get more in touch with who you really are and are able to, you know, get that clarity, you get more clear about what you want to do, and then your intellect serves you in doing that. I think that can be challenging for a lot of people because often they're working so hard on trying to figure out what they want to do or trying to, get a handwritten guarantee that it's going to work out the way they want it to. And often people moving from, more traditional employment into working with others and that sort of thing. And so I'd be very interested, the group that's on the call tonight, we did a program a few weeks ago called Passion and Purpose, which was looking at getting in touch with, life purpose. And I'd be really curious to know your thoughts on that as well.
Well, Jamie, to put it in a very simplistic way, if you think about, Jamie, the times when you just had that really peaceful feeling and you felt that clarity, and I know you have because you've told me about it. Now, I guarantee you when you're in that feeling and you have that clarity, that when you look at whatever you want to look at in this life, you will see it in a clearer, cleaner, sharper perspective. You won't be seeing it through the filter of all your repetitive cyclical thinking. So you get to see it for what it really is, and you get to make your choices from that clear, uncluttered perspective. Now, when we talk about the unknown, everything forward of this moment is unknown. Even though we have to plan and we have to decide general direction, we have to, say we're going to do this or we're going to do that or this is my passion. All that is true, but moving forward, you're always, no matter what you think, you're moving into the unknown. Now, this is what I know. I know that when you're in that quieter state, when you're closer to your true self, that you look on that experience of moving into the unknown as, I don't know how else to put it, as just fun, as an enjoyable experience, and you trust your wisdom, you trust your knowledge to decide and move forward. You're doing that anyway, That's what we're doing anyway, only we add all this, sometimes we add a lot of insecure thought about it, a lot of overthinking about it. I guess what I'd say is, when I think of the very best Jamie I know in that state of mind, I would trust him going forward into any situation. And I know he would do a great job. Now, I know that's a little nebulous, but that's how I see it.
Well, that really makes sense to me. So how did you come to be teaching the principles?
Well, when we first started listening to Sid, as I said, I was very skeptical even after I started listening, right? And then one night we went to one of his very early talks. It was probably no more than a year or so after he'd had his experience. And I was going in my general, I know more than this guy state of mind that I was living in then, even though I was miserable. And I sat down and Sid started to talk, and, I swear to God, I don't remember what he said, but something happened to me. I just went into this amazingly clear, quiet state that I'd never experienced before. Nothing even remotely like it, And I just remember being carried along and just loving that feeling, even though to this day I don't remember. I'm sure he was talking about the principles and about the spiritual world or whatever. But when it broke up, we went over to a friend's house, and there was half a dozen couples sitting around the fireplace. And I wasn't engaging at all. I was just kind of sitting back. And I was having this incredible feeling, and the notion that occurred to me, and it was more than a notion, the experience I had was a feeling that I really didn't know where my fingertip ended and the rest of the world began. I felt totally like there was only one thing. As a matter of fact, that morphed into a feeling of there was only one being in the room. And it was the most amazing, most beautiful feeling I had ever experienced, that sense that we were all just one being. And that kind of just drifted away, and the next few weeks was really, really nice. And then we ended up on a beach one night, late at night, around a big bonfire with a few people after another one of Sid's talks. And again, I had that really deep feeling, and it was a feeling of gratitude. I just felt such gratitude for the way I was experiencing life. Not so much for the details. I mean, I did. My life was better. My marriage was better. But what I was really feeling grateful for was the feeling I was experiencing. I'd experienced such negativity and depression and sickness up until then that I was just feeling really grateful for the feeling, And Sid was saying a few words to people around this campfire, and I started to get really emotional. And, I was still in that stage of Mr. Macho. I didn't want to show that to everybody. So I stood up and walked down the beach in the dark. And I found a log, and I sat on it. And pretty soon my wife Jan sat beside me, and we were just sitting there. It was super quiet except for the noise of the waves rolling into the beach on this beautiful, beautiful dark salt spring night. And as we sat there, I could feel a presence behind me, and I turned, and it was Sid. And he looked at me and Jan, and he said, "So you want to be a teacher?" And I hadn't thought about that yet. I literally had not thought about that yet. But I automatically answered yes. I mean, I don't know why, but I did. I just said yes. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, there's no life like it. It's the very best life in the world. He said, all you have to do is you wander through this world, and you find people in various stages of sleep, and then you touch them on the shoulder with love, and watch them wake up. And it just went right through me. I think of myself as kind of greedy because I live for that feeling. I love that feeling. It's what I want. And at that moment, I understood what he meant, at least to some degree, that sharing this, first of all, is the best way to grow yourself, and that secondly, it's the best life you can imagine. Now, I'm not saying everybody listening today or everybody who hears this needs to make it their life to go out and share the principles in a formal way. But honestly, if you live in that beautiful feeling and you see life in that perspective, for one thing, you see human beings totally differently. You're less frustrated, less upset with them because you see the innocence of everybody living in their separate realities. And you embrace life. You see it as beautiful. And like I said, it's not necessarily formal teaching, just you living in that state and being willing to hold on to and maintain that state when you're around people who are, let's say, less than healthy. It's a great way to teach. Just talking to somebody with an open, loving way, like the grocery store clerk or the person in the post office, that's sharing it as well, you know. But for me, to be able to share this with more and more people and to point them in this direction, that this wonderful man uncovered for us, these three principles that show us really the underpinnings of human experience. And when we understand those underpinnings, those principles, we can understand anything that's occurring psychologically in our lives. And that's kind of how I got started with it.
Well, and when you say when we understand these principles, one of the things that I've noticed, even just recently over the last few weeks, I remember when I first learned NLP, because NLP is looking at the structure of neurology, I found that there was a way in which that resonated with my neurology, I guess. My neurology, my senses and that sort of thing, liked to be communicated with in a way that acknowledged the neurology. And what I found with the three principles is that it's almost like my entire being has got a hold of them and is, you know, it's like now my being knows how my being creates reality. It really likes it. Sort of difficult to explain, but there's something about when the being, the entire self, whatever you want to call it, gets a hold of the very stuff we use to create our experience of reality moment to moment. There's something about that very, very powerful. And I see it almost as being like the universe waking up to itself.
Well, it is that, I think. You know, and it sounds grandiose, but it is. It's like when we see, the way I look at it is this, you know, that the three principles are spiritual facts. They're spiritual facts about how a spiritual world is created and maintained. And this is a spiritual world. We tend to think of it as a physical world made of matter, and it is. But matter is made of energy, and all energy is made of a deeper energy, a formless energy. So we're in this formless energy. We're living in it anyway. And when we listen to the principles and we have insights, we're really moving towards actually experiencing what's really happening. Because up until then, what we're experiencing is not what's happening, but what we think about what's happening.
Yeah, we're off at the movies.
Yeah, we honestly live at the end of our thinking until we begin to discover a world that exists, it truly exists before thinking.
Well, you know, when you describe them as spiritual facts, it raises something I know a lot of people are going to be interested in, Chip, which is that I know that you've done a lot taking these principles into businesses, into the U.S. prison system, into all kinds of different circumstances. With people like people working in, you know, successful medium-sized to large businesses, where talk of anything spiritual is, people are often afraid that will be dismissed as woo-woo or way out there, that sort of thing. What's your experience been of introducing these principles into in the business environment, and how do you do that?
Well, first of all, to be perfectly honest, you don't have to use the word spiritual. I assume this audience is farther ahead.
Oh, sure.
And it's a fit. Now, we can talk about universal principles, and you know what? People eventually figure out what that means. But, you don't have to run into anywhere and talk about the spiritual. And the other thing is, because we're talking about principles, one thing that we're capable of doing is listening to people about their world. And because the principles are the underpinnings of how all worlds are created, when we listen to people, we'll have insights that are going to be helpful to them, and we'll get them to a place where they will listen to the principles themselves and have their own insights. And there are clear pointers from the principles that speak to that world. Like, let me give you an example, okay? Over time, I've started to say less and less with my business clients about the specifics of what they're doing. However, I like to point them in certain directions. Like, for instance, if you think about the principle of thought, the true nature of thought is that it's totally creative. And because it's totally creative, and each of us has a free will, we each create our own world. Nobody lives in the same world. Okay? As Sid said in the DVD we listened to yesterday, we don't live in the same world. We live in the same district, but we don't live in the same world. Well, what that's pointing to is the existence of separate realities, that everybody lives in a separate reality. Now, when you think about organizational structure and you think about people trying to run a human enterprise of some kind, separate realities become something that is so informative to people, okay? Now, we think just really big picture. We think a CEO that's trying to move a large organization in a new direction, wants to get a new culture, wants to respond to his marketplace in a brand new way. And between him and the people actually delivering services or making products is a whole range of human beings, okay, at all different layers and levels in the business. And it's kind of a daunting thought to think that each and every one of those lives in his own separate reality. So a CEO may put out a vision and a message about what he wants. And among his managers reporting to him will be some that get it very, very clearly and that are in sync. Some who think they get it but are hanging on to something else. Some who actually oppose it, and so on and so forth. So as you move down through, and with innocence, as you move down through the organizational structure, the story begins to change. So you get down to one group of employees who have a clear picture, who are really enjoying themselves. Another department where there's a little bit of ambiguity and people are not sure about where they're going and what they're doing. And another department where there's a lot of strife. Now, when I just look at that with common sense, and if I had a group of leaders who were, first of all, introduced to the principles for the sake, put it this way, for the sake of mental clarity, confidence, and creativity. And they began to just have a sense of the existence of separate realities. What they would learn is that if you acknowledge the existence of separate realities and you respect the fact that they exist, it leads you to certain actions. And to me, the actions would be that maybe not the CEO, maybe somebody that he has working for him, and maybe he does too, first of all talks to the chain of command and said, we're in this together and we're going to find a way to create this unified vision. And so therefore, we're going to be talking to everybody, and I don't want anybody to be alarmed because whatever we find, we're going to coach each other towards that unified vision. And so I've seen many, many cases where the CEO and the senior team begin to sometimes even go down and do baseline jobs or go out and visit clients with consultants, whatever, and begin to see what's going on at all levels in their organization and then coaching everybody towards that vision, all in a very positive way. So a simple thing like thought is truly, truly a creative force, but it is also the source of separate realities. Just acknowledging that gives you so much direction on where to look and how to create a unified vision and a unified force moving forward in your organization. I mean, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it certainly does. It certainly does. And in teaching the principles themselves in organizations, how do you find people respond to them?
It's a mixed bag. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't. But first of all, the way I'm working these days is I want a CEO to begin with that's really interested. I want to talk to a CEO that really has a sense of what this is, not so much necessarily on the spiritual level, but on the level of understanding that these principles create reality, that these principles create everybody's reality and everybody's functioning from them. Somebody like that who is a visionary and who has a dream, those principles will speak to his vision and his dream, and he'll become excited. Now, once we have that, then we can talk to broader groups. And I say that because I just know it's just a fact of life that as the head goes, so go the feet.
Yeah.
But, if we have somebody high enough in a department or we have a CEO, then we start teaching the principles. And I'll be honest, I back into them. I don't go in there talking about the spiritual nature of life. I listen to what they have to say, the world they're living in, and probably start with something more practical about thought. But the beauty is I know that I'm always leading people back to the real essence of the principles. And once they have an insight there, their thinking shifts. They begin to see more creatively. They begin to do new things. Like going down and visiting different levels of the organization is not something I want to recommend. It's something I want them to have a profound insight about and be totally charged up about doing. And so when we move through the organization, we teach more people about the principles. You don't have to get 100%. I'll tell you what, if you give me a team of 10 senior managers or senior leaders and we affect 4 or 5 of them, that team will never be the same. I guarantee that team will never be the same because there's a whole level of protection that occurs for each person that finds the true meaning of these principles and gets closer to their true nature. I like to say they get like a suit of armor because they can look at it all with security and confidence and without fear and without worry, and they see the innocence of everybody else's behavior, and they're not reactive to everybody else's behavior, and in doing so are really, really able to work from what I call a state of service. And that's where the change begins. All human enterprises are just that. They're human enterprises. And the degree to which people work together and trust each other and listen at a deep level, to my mind, is the greatest predictor of the long-term success of that organization.
That's a really, really powerful statement, actually. The degree to which people trust each other and work together and have a good feeling for each other is the best predictor of the long-term success of that organization, or probably any venture, actually.
Well, I think so, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I worked with police departments. I mean, we always think of them, and no knock if there's any policemen here, but it's generally kind of paranoid cultures. They are.
Sure.
Ones I've experienced. And yet, when I've worked with some police leaders who have embraced these principles and settled down, somehow they've managed to move through their organization and begin to break down that paranoia, Because again, it's just thought. That's the thing. It's just thought. And people think what they're seeing is just because they think it's real. Because they think it's real, they respond to it emotionally, viscerally, intellectually, as if it's real, And when anybody shows them with love and understanding just a little bit of the fact that it's not, that we can think anything we want, we can create any kind of culture we want. It doesn't really matter about the past. We can get by it. For many people, that represents a lot of relief. And who doesn't want to live and work in a great team, Who doesn't want that? It's just that people get to the point where they don't believe it's possible sometimes in some environments, And I think those leaders that we meet who have some understanding of what human beings really are and the power of thought, mind, and consciousness, it's like they get that added to their gifts. They're already powerful leaders, but when they get that added to their gifts, they're able to export that understanding throughout their organization. And that's what you want. You want a unified perspective.
Well,
Jamie, we have a question.
Go ahead, Liz.
We have a question from Chantel about working with leaders, and she's asking, Chip, if you can achieve a lot in one day, or does it have to be a longer duration?
Well, that really depends on the person. There's no pat answer to that. Now, I've had conversations with a leader where in the first 10 minutes, I knew we were on. You know what I mean? I could see that they were excited, they were picking up on something, and they were already having new ideas, which to me is the best indicator that they're getting something. And I've worked with other people for months and sometimes even years. So there's no pat answer to that. I do know that for the most part, I would say the greatest number of leaders that I've got to work with for, let's say, more than a day, have definitely heard something within a fairly short period of time. And you know what? I don't ask them to believe anything that I say. I ask them to try and have this experience and listen to this wisdom and then go out and see what happens in their world for themselves, So sometimes when I do focus groups where leaders from different companies talk to me on the phone or in a conference, one of the things I'm really, really looking for is them to tell stories to each other. It becomes so much more powerful when that happens. So, there really isn't a specific answer. I just know that you'll see a moment when your client, there's a light that comes on, there's a feeling that occurs. What I would caution you is that if you pick up on that and you have that sense that that person is seeing something, it's a really good time to trust being quiet for a while and just let it percolate until that person says something. I think, and I'll speak for myself, there was a time when I missed those moments quite often because I was too busy trying to be a consultant.
Actually, we have another question along those lines from Elaine in London, and she says, once you've enabled the CEO to really understand everyone is working with their own reality, how do you coach them more specifically so people work together?
Well, it's interesting. Again, it's the approach of the strength of the team is in the strength of the link. So I actually don't say as much as I used to about how to work together, other than to talk a little bit about what real listening is. And I'm dependent on each individual hearing something deep enough to quiet their minds down a little bit, become a little less fearful and trepidatious and reactive to the environment. And what I find is when people get quieter like that, they almost automatically listen at a new level. And actually they do, because what happens if their minds get quieter, all of us in organizational settings or when we work with other people or any relationship for that matter, have this internal dialogue that's going on, this cyclical thinking that's going on about them, what a group they're from, or what they're like. And what I find is when a number of individuals in the team back out of that thinking, it automatically has a profound effect on the relationships. Things start to get better right away. And the best thing that can happen is if a few people get it for themselves first, and then they start to infect others with a better relationship. And then when you meet and talk about the principles and the whole idea of just listening at a higher level to each other, they begin to tell their stories. Now, when the people in the organization itself begin to tell their stories, you've got something going. And you can sit back as a consultant and watch people grow. Now, there are some common sense things, obviously, that we can tell people about listening at all levels, seeing the innocence of separate realities. I like to teach people a little bit about separate realities in organizations because it's such a big part of what they're dealing with. See, I used to teach a lot more. I was an HR manager during the whole invasion of Japanese techniques in manufacturing in North America, and I taught all that just on time, total quality management, employee groups, employee input groups, all of that kind of stuff, all of which is valuable. However, I saw that when the level of consciousness of the group rose up, they were able to pick what was truly valuable in all those I call those overlays because they're overlaid over the business of the day. I found that people could really see what was clearly useful in all of that and actually discard some of it, but more than anything, make it their own. They made it their own. In all my travels in business, I've seen many of those programs gathering dust on shelves after a few years, except for the places where people, in addition to those things, gain some knowledge that could help them elevate their level of consciousness, then their wisdom, their common sense, and their creativity makes the best of all that. Plus, they're motivated from what they see, not from what they're told. And that's a huge difference. When people are motivated from what they actually see, their own insights, it's a totally different kind of motivation than being motivated by a program that's been introduced. So I've moved away over the years from telling people a lot of how-tos to really just making them comfortable by listening to their world and having compassion and understanding for it, and then teaching the principles along with a few common sense pointers of where they might apply. And I know it sounds overly simple, but that's where I've seen the greatest success with this in business.
So I hope you enjoyed listening to that as much as I enjoyed doing the original interview. And if you want to find out more about the Clarity Life Transformation Retreat and see what's involved about spending a week with Jan and Chip and me in Tenerife this May, head over to jamiesmart.com/retreat. Bye. Thanks for listening. If you want to experience a clear mind more of the time with better performance and bigger results, here's what to do next. Discover your personal clarity quotient by answering 20 simple questions at jamiesmart.com/CQ. This quick and easy questionnaire gives you a snapshot of your current state of mind, and it's totally free. You'll find out your stress score and your engagement score, as well as getting some ideas about how you can improve your overall clarity quotient. It'll only take you a few minutes to do, and you can get it for free at jamiesmart.com/CQ. And finally, I want to ask you a favor that'll only take you 30 seconds or even less, and it'll make a huge difference to me, my guests, and our community. If you like this show, then please let me and my guests know. And the quickest, easiest ways you can do this right now is subscribe to this podcast, because that's how you can let us know you like it. It's super easy, and it would really mean a lot to me. Just head over to iTunes right now, search for The Results Mindset, then click on the show and hit subscribe. Once again, it'll only take you 30 seconds or even less, and it'll make a big difference to me because it helps people who resonate with my work to find this podcast. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate your help, so go ahead and subscribe now. Thanks for listening.